So let me just tell you and the people listening what happened in Brazil this week is, like I said, I think it's an incredibly interesting controversy in and of itself, but it has really broader implications for a lot of things we talk about here. So many of these Western democracies, and I include Brazil now in, sort of if not technically the West. I mean, technically it is the West, but often metaphorically it's more talked about as the global South. But it's part of the modern democratic world for sure. So many of these controversies are kind of harbingers of what's coming to other places. So I think they're really worth looking at. So basically, and it's ironic that this controversy unfolded now, right as there's this huge, storm surrounding Joe Rogan in the United States, because the podcaster at the center of the controversy in Brazil, whose name is Monarch, that's his, kind of stage name, has modeled himself after Joe Rogan. He's a huge Joe Rogan fan, and the podcast he created in Brazil, it follows the model of Rogan. It's 3 or 4 hours long. It's kind of meandering. It has no set agenda. They invite everybody on. They've had every major leftist on, every major Bolsonarista, everyone in between. They will invite anyone on. They have incredibly respectful, civil conversations. They pride themselves on not being ideologically captive or attached to a partisan faction. Very similar to Rogan. They're very genuine about it. I'm saying they because there's two of them, but Monarch is the main host. And it's become wildly popular, especially among young people who don't have strong partisan or ideological identification. So again, a very similar dynamic to Rogan. I actually went on the show twice in the last 4 months, once by myself in September, the second time in November with my husband, who, as some of you know, is a member of Congress. And just like when I went on Rogan, I got a kind of better understanding of why that show works, why so many people like it. It's precisely because it has the kind of dialogue that you feel like you would have if you got invited over to somebody's house, which is completely different than the way people speak on television or corporate media, the tone they use, the topics they discuss, the way they discuss them. It just feels much more natural and kind of more organic and more honest. And one of the major causes he's undertaken, which is not surprising given that part of the ecosystem he's now occupying, is free speech. And, in the West, you kind of have these poles of free speech. Like the U.S. obviously has the most absolute theory of free speech of any country in the democratic world. It's not actually absolute, but it's closer to being absolute than I'd say other countries. Maybe there are a couple others that are similar. The majority, I think, are more like Canada and Western Europe, where there are just some ideas declared, I guess you could call them banned or off limits or even criminal. Overt racism, overt homophobia, overt xenophobia, things that you couldn't criminalize in the U.S. because of the First Amendment. That's kind of the, sort of sweet spot, like the majoritarian sentiment for how the West handles free speech. And then Brazil, I would say, is on the other extreme, where free speech is almost not even a kind of value universally considered positive. If you even use the phrase free speech, unlike in the West, where even people who want to restrict it always say, oh, of course I believe in free speech, and then the restrictions come, it's almost considered like a right-wing or a fascist concept even, free speech. It's not really recognized as the value itself, and there's an endless number of laws that allow you to either be sued or criminally prosecuted for ideas that you express, including the obvious ones like racism and homophobia and xenophobia and things like that, but also, apologies for Nazism. There are parties that are banned based on certain ideas, including the Nazi Party. So on this show that happened, I think it was on Monday. I'm sorry, maybe it was on Friday. The show is off. It's 4 hours long. The host drinks during the show. By the end of it, he's kind of inebriated. And the topic came up about a law in Brazil that bans and makes illegal anyone creating a Nazi party. And Monarch using his kind of free speech ideology, said, I don't see why the government should have the power to ban the existence of parties. And he had on two members of Congress, this kind of center-right member of Congress who's notable because he's of Japanese descent, one of the very few people in public life in Brazil who is, and he's kind of libertarian. He said, yeah, I think you're right. I think Germany made a mistake banning the Nazi Party from being able to exist. And then there was this woman who's a member of Congress, kind of centrist-y, and she said, how can you guys say this? Nazism is dangerous for Jews. By definition, a party based on Nazism would be a party that would say, we don't like Jews. And the podcast host said, well, why can't somebody not like Jews? Why aren't you allowed to not like Jews? Why is the government able to force you to like Jews? So the way he said it was incredibly insensitive. It was crude. It was stupid. He was drunk when he said it. He apologized the next day for it. But no, it was one of the biggest controversies in Brazil. He instantly got fired despite being the most popular podcaster in Brazil. And now both he and the member of Congress, who did nothing more but say that he thought, of course, Nazism is an evil ideology, but that the government should be in the business of banning it, are facing criminal prosecution and the very real possibility of going to prison for violating this criminal law that bans an apology for Nazism. I entered the discussion, unsurprisingly, in part because, it was very odd. Brazil is a country that has almost no Jews in it. It's just a country that has a tiny, minuscule Jewish population. Just to give you an idea, the U.S. has 320 million people at a population, and almost 8 million Jews are U.S. citizens. So 8 million out of 320 million, more Jews live in the U.S. than any country in the world, including Israel. It's very close, but more, I think, are in the U.S. now. Brazil is a country, 220 million people, with a total Jewish population of 100,000 people. We're invisible in Brazilian discourse. And so there was just this automatic assumption that all these people were speaking for Jews by demanding that these laws stay in place and be even strengthened, banning the defense of the right to be Nazis or the right to be anti-Semitic or homophobic. And I just found it interesting for two reasons. One is that, the consensus on the left in Brazil is that Brazil is one of the most racist and homophobic and fascist countries in the world. That's why they elected Jair Bolsonaro. Racism is an extraordinarily grave problem. It's a consensus that there's systemic racism governing Brazil. Homophobia, even worse. Bolsonaro ran on a homophobic platform. It was a major part of why he won. More LGBTs are killed in hate crimes in Brazil than any other country. So there's kind of this immediate odd contradiction that to say, well, look, we have all these great laws criminalizing homophobia, racism, and fascism, but they don't seem to be working very well, given that your own views are that those ideas that you've banned by law are thriving more than ever. But the other really interesting aspect of it, Q, that I is the thing that's really interesting to me is that I don't think a lot of people understand that this idea of what is called and what was being maligned as kind of absolute free speech ideology came not out of right-wing movements, but came out of left-wing movements, and specifically Jewish leftism, in part because of the history of leftist Jews. It was mostly leftist Jews who were persecuted under Woodrow Wilson as opponents of U.S. involvement in the First World War. Those were the socialists primarily who ended up supporting FDR. It was a big Jewish socialist movement that got persecuted using powers of censorship. The prelude to the ascension of the Nazi Party was to take the censorship laws of the Weimar Republic and use it to close Jewish shops, ban Jewish books, silence Jewish groups, close Jewish press. So censorship was a tool, obviously, of Nazism. But then I think the most important part was, in the Cold War and in the McCarthy era, there were a lot of Jews, disproportionately, who were members of the Communist Party, who were in some way linked to left-wing communist activism. And McCarthyism was nothing but an attempt to criminalize the existence of the Communist Party. And that was why the ACLU and other similar groups like it, driven not only, but largely by Jewish leftists, began defending an absolutist theory of free speech. It's what led Chomsky in 1981 in that controversy in France, where there was a professor who was calling into question parts of Holocaust orthodoxy, claiming that there wasn't evidence to suggest, this many Jews died in Auschwitz or Buchenwald, that they wanted to fire. And Chomsky intervened, one of the only voices who did so, and said, if you fire this professor, you're destroying academic freedom. He has the right to express these views. And, he was isolated on the left and called a Nazi sympathizer, despite the fact that a huge portion of his family was murdered by the Holocaust. So I find really interesting the fact that there is this belief that this kind of free speech belief is now the hallmark of the right, when it actually came out of Jewish activist leftism. And I am increasingly concerned that this kind of extreme speech control, where a podcaster can actually be criminally prosecuted, he's being interrogated by, prosecutors and police for the opinion he expressed on his podcast, is something that is going to start creeping more and more, even into not just Western European countries, but the United States. Like, is a harbinger for a trend that I think is very worrying. So I'm definitely interested in your overall views on that controversy.
Having read about the screw up where he said that he was drunk at the time, and based on what he said, or at least like the excerpt that I heard that was translated, this is going to sound wild, but I don't really see the big fucking deal here. I don't. I think that when you say something stupid, you should be able to just apologize and move on. I don't know whether he was actually wasted or not. I do think that when you're wasted and you say something like that, it probably does belie a little bit of what you actually believe. At the same time, people have been saying, I hear this in Canada all the time, where we do have hate speech laws, that hate speech shouldn't be a crime, that people should be able to support Nazism and all sorts of odious beliefs if they want to. I do also think that one of the ways that the left shoots itself in the foot is by allowing the far right to co-opt free speech, because we know that free speech is never utilized in a fair way. Like, the people who crow about free speech the most do not value it. And if they did, then why is it, for example, that when a University of Toronto professor is essentially let go from a job that she was offered because she's written statements that were critical of the state of Israel, that's not cancel culture, that's not violating somebody's free speech? Like, Barry Weiss, for example, who's like one of the biggest free speech champions you can find, goes around trying to cancel everybody. She's tried to cancel satirical artists. She's tried to cancel pro-Palestinian speakers as anti-Semites. Like, I find that the people who seem to have the most investment in free speech don't actually value it. They just want themselves to be able to have privileged speech. And I think one of the problems that the left has, they don't claim this issue to a strong enough extent that they can wrest it back from the right wing. I think if you do value free speech, then it means that if somebody loses a teaching position, if somebody loses a job, if somebody is surveilled by law enforcement or intelligence agencies because they're talking about what their government is actually doing, or how the United States is, for example, like funding neo-Nazi militias abroad or sends money to autocratic dictators, etc., and you're afraid to say these things out loud because you may be surveilled, you may be subject to arrest or harassment or whatever, you may have your career limited, then that's something that you need to jump behind and defend. And I don't believe in using the carceral state to police people's speech myself. I think you just have to make a convincing enough case to get people on your side and help them understand that hateful ideologies and humanity are not compatible. So I think where it comes to this, like, kerfluffle, like, it's kind of wild to me that it became that big of a deal because I could turn on AM radio at any point in the day and hear somebody saying the exact same thing. Yes, there should be no political party should be banned. Maybe there should be a Nazi party, and if there was, nobody would join it, which proves that Nazism is a failed ideology. That's not
Well,
mainstream at all.
like in the U.S., where Nazi parties are permitted, and if they get 10 people to come to one of their meetings, they're lucky. It's like a loser party, right? Like people walk around
Right.
with swastikas on their armbands are pathetic. Like no one even cares, no one even notices, no one takes it seriously. And it is true that on some level, when you start banning it, it gives it a power and a strength. Like we can't tolerate it because this is a potent force as opposed to something that is easily defeated. I do want to just say, like, the point that you raise is an important one, and I try and emphasize it as much as I can. I do find it ironic and bothersome that the free speech wing that has emerged on the right, like the kind of IDW, Barry Weiss is like a kind of symbol of it, even like just traditional conservatives who have taken up the free speech banner in a way that I'm happy they've done. They do have this incredible blind spot where, every assertion of bigotry or racism or misogyny or homophobia or transphobia gets mocked, is immediately treated as unjust, as an attempt to stifle speech, which often it is. But they are so often the ones who use exactly that same tactic to call people anti-Semitic at the slightest, with the thinnest
Slightest
read of
provocation.
evidence. Yeah. Like any criticism of Israel instantly results in them being willing to
The
vilify those people as
the
bigots. And
wildest thing to
exactly
me, the wildest thing to me is seeing somebody like Ellie Valley, who was referring to when I mentioned the satirical artist, that she's tried to get him canceled from speaking events and canceled from gigs, like getting people to drop him as a speaker or as a guest and he's a Jewish man himself, and she says that he's anti-Semitic. It kind of boggles the mind because they never concern themselves with the preservation of free speech for their political opponents. They're concerned with the preservation of free speech for themselves, and then will do the exact thing that they accuse the other side of doing to stop their opponents from being able to speak. Thanks for listening. To listen to full live episodes of the Unredacted show with Glenn Greenwald and me, Q Anthony Omene, find us on Callin. Download the app from the App Store on iPhone or iPad to join the conversation live every Thursday at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time.